Welcome everyone to this webinar on private land conservation in Europe. We are very glad to have so many of you here with us today in a very international audience, because today in the room we have landowners, we have land managers, policymakers, stakeholders of different projects and interested parties. So good afternoon to you joining for Europe and good morning for those joining from the United States. And welcome today for this third webinar organized by the European Landowners Organization and the Nature Conservancy. This online event is the third one in a row hosted by the Life Plus project Land is Forever. This project has the aim to expand the use of voluntary conservation tools and new instruments in Europe from which private landowners can benefit for their conservation efforts. Last week, we had two very successful online sessions, which were taking the audience on a virtual tour to several private estates in Maryland and Virginia in the US. They were showing some very inspiring examples of how they're organizing their private management over there with the support of the Nature Conservancy. If you didn't have the chance to join these sessions, I warmly invite you to our project website, where you can find the recording of these sessions. And also the recording of this webinar will be made available here. But today we stay in Europe, and this webinar will take you to 7 inspiring and innovative examples of management structures set up by private landowners and managers. And the owners and managers of these 7 examples, they shared their experiences and lessons learned with us. And during this webinar, we want to give you a summary and an overview of these outcomes. So we will welcome 2 representatives also of 2 cases we will present you, and they can share with you their experiences live during this webinar. Today we have the chance to host Jürgen Tack. He's the scientific director at ILO, and he will give you an introduction to 7 innovative examples of management structures to organize nature conservation on private land in Europe. Also, a warm welcome to Otto von Arnold. He's a chairman and landowner and farmer himself, and he's here with us today to tell us some more about Tullstorp Stream Project in Sweden. And also welcome to Christophe Lenaerts. He's the president of the Flemish Private Landowners Association. He's a private landowner himself and a member of the case at the Nato Airfield we are presenting today. My name is Anne-Sophie Muller. I'm part of the project team and I will guide you through the presentations today. Before giving the floor to Jürgen, I would like to mention that there will be time to exchange and ask questions at the end of this 1-hour webinar. We warmly invite you to send us your questions during all the presentations using the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Jürgen, the floor is yours.
Well, Anne-Sophie, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. And indeed, I have to say I had and I have the pleasure to coordinate this project, but I have to say most of it is managed by Anne-Sophie, to be honest. But I have the pleasure to introduce you to 7 case studies. I will first explain you a little bit how we have chosen those 7 case studies, because the project has been searching for a number of conservation tools as we are using them in Europe. That makes that at this moment we have a full menu of what the different EU member states are presenting or having in their portfolio on nature conservation tools for private landowners. On the other side, we have been studying the different structures private landowners have to do nature conservation. They can do that in person. Sometimes they are forming small groups, small NGOs, to make sure that they have a good basis to do private nature conservation. Now, based on the instruments available in the different EU member states on one side, based on the different structures the private landowners are setting up to organize the private land conservation, the combination of those 2 brought us to 7 case studies using different tools, different structures. So I will guide you in the next, let's say, 10 minutes through 7 of those case studies, each time explaining a little bit what they do and how they are working, what kind of tools they are using. 2 out of those case studies will be presented by one of the private landowners which are part of the case study, of course, for those two case studies, I will give less info and I will leave it, at least most of it, to the owners themselves. I first would like to take you to the Netherlands. I would like to take you to the National Park, the Hoge Veluwe, which is a national park in the Netherlands, one of the bigger ones and the only private one. The park is managed by an independent foundation that only makes limited use of governmental subsidies. Let's say they have more or less 10% of those subsidies, but in reality, if necessary, they would be able to run the park completely independent of those subsidies. That's something which they are capable of doing so because they are making use of paying visitors for their survival. The aim of the national park is to have an environmental sustainability while having a public opening of the park, and at the same time they are providing and organizing a wide variety of contemporary activities and facilities, which is depending on the time of the year. We have to say they're extremely lucky because they have a world-known museum in the center of the national park, and that makes that, let's say, the park is having a lot of interest not only in nature but also in architect, art, and the history of the area. When bringing all of this together, we have to say that the national park is making use of a private foundation, let's say a private foundation which is led in reality by a manager who is able to make all of the decisions for the private land conservation within the park. He's making use of a large board of directors with a lot of experts coming from very different fields. And let's say the board of directors, together with a number of expert groups, are giving advice to the manager, but it's the manager who finally takes a decision and is implementing those decisions within the management of the national park. For this park, financial independence is extremely important, and that, as said, they can only realize thanks to public access with a certain payment. The park is one of the biggest ones and one of the most successful ones, showing that a private foundation bringing the interest of different stakeholders together is certainly a working option. The next case study is a private organic farm managing public land. This is a very particular case, is the case of the Vresselhof in Belgium, which is a farm run by Joe Dirac together with his wife. And let's say he's, first of all, an organic farmer, but to make sure that he's able to close the carbon loops within the farm, he was very much interested in the nearby forest on, let's say, more or less 25 hectares, but a forest which was owned by an agency which is responsible for the highways in Flanders. The 25 hectares of forest and a little bit of agricultural land is owned by that agency because it's nearby one of the major highways, and it was once bought with the idea, if we have to make the highway more broader than today, we should be able to do so. We were able, within the project Land is Forever, to bring the owners of het Vresselhof and the agency of the Flemish community together to start a discussion on how they could help each other in doing a number of aspects. That led to a management agreement towards the restoration of the public land. This is done completely free of charge. It is so that, let's say, the Vresselhof is making use of agricultural subsidies up to a limited level. They are very much interested in their product label, which is of course organic, but let's say it's exactly the interaction and the closing of the different cycles which is the main reason for them to participate in private land conservation. The next case study is bringing us to Spain. El Castañar is a family estate. It's a very large farm. It's a little bit more than 5,000 hectares, but it's a farm with a magnificent surrounding, and with the production of as well cereals, oil, vegetables. There's a vineyard, and let's say they are really famous for their bull breeding, sheep, and Iberian pigs. They have been running several live projects. They are one of the most successful estates with Iberian lynx, and they have several of the imperial eagles on their estates. Next to the agricultural activities, there is some hunting and tourism on the estate. And El Castañar is a specific example of a family estate run and managed by a family which stepped into a voluntary label, which is the Wildlife Estates label. The Wildlife Estates label, which is a label for private landowners who are taking very well care of the biodiversity on their estates, and to which they have to fill in a very extensive questionnaire at the European level. And only if they show that they are capable to create and to maintain a high biodiversity quality, they are able to get the label. This is a very typical example of a private landowner, of a family who is owning the land, who is managing the land, and who is making use of a number of economic factors to support not only the agriculture part of the estate, but also of the part of the estate which is really managed towards biodiversity. A fourth case brings us to France. There we have Plaine des Mazeroles, which is, let's say, a wetlands area, which is, let's say, partly dry, partly wet during summer, making that there are some agricultural activities on the dry parts in summer, but is, let's say, flooded during winter, making it, let's say, a paradise for overwintering birds in that area of France. Here we have an association of local land managers, 70 in total. There are owners and users of an in total 750 hectares large damped marsh. The reason they have put together the association is to establish a water level management protocol to allow agricultural activities necessary for the maintenance of the marsh, but at the same time to ensure a number of economic activities, but also to be actively involved in nature conservation and maintaining some of the very, very interesting, sometimes rare habitats within the area. Here we have a group of people. They are working within a smaller NGO, not making use of subsidies, but really developing a number of agricultural activities, which they are selling, making use of the fact that they are not only farming, but that they're also doing nature conservation within the estates. The next one brings us to Sweden, the Tullstorp Stream Project. This is a very nice project in which we see that a larger group of people, of landowners, and a number of supporting members are brought together. This is a project which will be later on presented by one of the landowners participating to the project. So I will go a little bit faster through this one, and then we can go to the next one, which is the Nato Airfield in Muller, which is in Belgium. Here too, we have a Nato Airfield with a lot of potential towards nature conservation because the airfield is in the middle of a Natura 2000 site. There too, we have one of the local owners who want to participate in the project with us. So I will leave the explanation to him. And then we have a seventh case, a very intriguing one, because the Flemish nature legislation since 2017 gives the possibility not only to NGOs, but also to private landowners to purchase land with a subsidy of 80% by the Flemish community. Formerly, that was only possible by NGOs. Since 2017, also private landowners can make use of this subsidy. However, they first have to show that they were able to make qualitative good nature, and that means that in reality, the landowner needs to have a smaller nature reserve before he or she is able to buy additional land. This gives a problem for many landowners as they do not have that what we call type 4 nature in Flanders, but which is in reality a nature reserve. And so we have now an NGO who has purchased a type 4 nature reserve and who is now willing to buy land for private landowners, making use of this 80% subsidy on the condition that the private landowner is contributing 20% of the total money. And then the NGO is taking over the management in collaboration with the private landowner, so that the private landowner is able to assist as much as possible. And then this procedure is something we have developed as a new tool within the Land is Forever project, but is only one out of many tools. Now, those tools and the different structures will also be discussed during the webinar this week on Wednesday. So welcome there also, where we will be able to go a little bit deeper into the instruments. But those were the 7 case studies. I give the floor back to Anne-Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. That was a very clear overview. And before giving the floor to our 2 land managers who are participating in this webinar, I would like to present you some of the outcomes of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats we identified together with the landowners and the stakeholders of the different cases. Because these are very important issues to take into account before implementing similar management structures elsewhere or on a larger scale. If we start with the strength, a very important one they mentioned was the independency, and that was mainly the case for cases where with financial independency. Because if they feel independent, they feel like they have more flexibility to interfere immediately if something happens on the land. They can freely accept corporations. They don't feel dependent on short-term policies, for example, subsidy regulations. And it also makes them more motivated for more and longer investigations. This brings us to the second strength, the long-term vision, because we saw that with a continuous, consistent management vision, that other stakeholders know what they can get from these landowners or in these structures on the longer term, which makes them a very trustable, passionate partner for corporations. Also very important is the diversification of activities they all have to make their management structures durable on the long term. And often this is necessary to give them certain financial independence and security. In the examples that we saw the agricultural product diversification, or the case in the Netherlands where they have cultural and touristic services together with nature conservation. And in Sweden, we will see they also have educational services. What is also a very important strength, of course, is the environmental value they all have of the area that they restored or created because of or maintained by this particular management structure. In the examples that we saw, we had the holistic landscape scale management, where landowners gather to manage the land together, or also because of their specific active management or unique management vision. Also important is the active field involvement they all have. They have field expertise themselves, or they have close engagement and motivation of the field experts and stakeholders through this management structures. And this gives them a perfect in-house understanding of the land and the activities needed to manage it. And for those having public involvement in their management structures, this was another very important strength. Having this positive example to show, investing in PR and communication, and it gives them the support and recognition of the local community. Then weaknesses. So we had as a strength the independency, but then for those, some of them also feel still dependent, and that was mainly on decision makers, because some decisions are made on the short term. Also, of course, the success of the model and the director and the corporations with stakeholders. Another weakness was the lack of resources, but also limitations that they feel because limitations are caused because they are only a small partner or a small business, or sometimes even more difficult if there are none of these two. Then continuing with opportunities. First opportunity that they all saw are the environmental challenges, because these challenges today are creating more awareness for the public. People become more interested to learn about conservation projects. They become more willing to pay for environmental friendly products, or even they become more willing to be engaged as a volunteer. Here also interest for innovative ways to implement or support nature conservation is raising. Also, we see rising interest of stakeholders and research institutions, which is very interesting for landowners to get in a cooperation with them, because they can support the land managers on the scientific side, and the other way around, the land managers can support the research institutions with in-field results. They also saw huge opportunities in more adapted tools and programs to support their project corporations or small initiatives. Important here is that tools should understand the economic requirements to make them independent and durable on the long term. There are already many positive examples, successful examples, like the several we saw here today, all over Europe and over the US. And it's very important also that we show indeed these successful examples. This can be on local scale by learning from other communes, for example, or by using ambassadors of successful projects to motivate landowners elsewhere. And with this very multidisciplinary audience we have today, we should all be aware of some important threats also, which were mentioned. And because they can influence, of course, the success of new conservation projects and initiatives on private land. First one is the negative public opinion that it's often linked with public ignorance or a lack of communication or a bad image generated by disinformation. To give you an example, in France, public was not aware of, it's maybe not aware of the challenges that the management has today to maintain the biodiversity, or in the Netherlands, in Hoge Veluwe, many visitors are not even aware that the entrance fee is really needed to maintain the unique habitats that they are visiting. Also, the feeling of competition with conservation NGOs often plays a role. But for this can be linked with the opportunity that we saw of learning from successful examples, because here also during this webinar we presented you some good examples of respectful cooperations between the private landowners and NGOs. And for these cases, it always started with open discussions, listening to the needs and the wishes of both sides, and then step by step it evaluated to a successful cooperation. Another threat was the lack of governmental support, but of course this varies between the regions. But for the cases presented, it was often caused by negative experiences before or mistrust of private landowners. And also important to mention here is that for some of them it was the case because they are seen more like private entrepreneurs or private or businessmen more than land managers engaged in nature conservation, because they need a certain income, of course, to make their conservation durable on the long term. Then we also had existing support regulations, which are not always adapted to reality. Certain regulations are not feasible for small-scale initiatives, or does not take into account external influences on the land with an effect on the land management. And also the durability of the model can be a threat if it is experiencing difficulties. But as we said, this very much depends on the support. that they get, but also on the flexibility and the motivation of the management team to keep adapting to external influences. What we also learned from our case studies was one very good advice, which was saying, thinking and acting in solutions and accept the challenges and threats and use them as an opportunity. And so with this advice, I would like to give the floor to our two land managers now, which we have here today with us, and they're already following this advice quite well. For the first one, we go to Sweden, to the Tullstorp Stream Project, and Otto von Arnold, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and share this experience and learn from others. This is the way we should manage this these problems. I would first want to, when we switch to the first slide, please. And the Tullstorp Stream is situated in the most southern part of Sweden, very fertile land, which is agricultural land. And this has some certain problems, which I will come to very soon. Well, what we have done is to construct 200 hectares of wetland all along a stream, and we have taken all the catchment area of the stream, which is important because then you can have a comprehensive approach towards it. The aim is very much based on the water directive, because the water directive was implemented in Sweden in a quite tough way, to say, towards the farmers. And we have in this southern part of Sweden, where with heavy agriculture, lots of pollutions coming from agriculture and from others also. It's not only the farmers' fault, but mainly because it has been restructured or renovated in a quite tough way. What we'd started to do is to make a landowners cooperative where everybody should participate. We founded a economic association with a board and a project manager. The project manager is employed by the association. One very important keyword is a voluntary basis. Those who want to take part can do so, and up till now, we have 100% of all the landowners coming along. I will come back to why. And what is also, it is one of the unique projects in Sweden, because this is, we take the whole catchment area, and it is a private, a Swedish pilot project for all of the Baltic Sea. So please, next. What, as I said, the problems where we was mainly, we had a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus transportation into the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea is certainly very vulnerable and very sensible in many ways. Of course, this has been a restored river, and of course it has very small buffer capacity. So we have flooding and drought, one each other, and also with the steep slopes, we've got a lot of erosions. And in the agricultural landscape, I would not say it's a desert, but it is very little biodiversity. So this was also one of the problems. And for people, which is quite a densely populated area, there was no really area to walk around and come around with. Please, next. So those were the challenges, as I mentioned, and it was not only the chemical question with the phosphorus and nitrogen, but the other ones came along besides this. So the recreation was important to handle the erosion and the flooding and the biodiversity also. And one thing that is very important, that the landowners were looked upon as environmental villains. Thank you. So what did we do? There were things to do within the river and beside the river. And the meandering to make the river move slowlier. Two-stage stitches, also the same idea, depending on how the landscape looked like. Slope adjustments and controlling flooding areas so that you slow down the water and to catch the nutrients, and also a sedimental trap, especially for phosphorus. And then the fish, we had quite a lot of trout coming up now, and we had playing areas for the fish. And and besides the river, tree planting, wetlands, and wetlands is mainly to where you connect the drainage system so that the drainage water can get rid of the nutrients in the wetlands. And of course, that has to be transferred back into the fields. And lots of information telling people what are we doing. This is very important because, as I said, we were looked upon as villains before, and now today it has somewhat changed. Please change. So it was not only a theoretical exercise; it was very much landscaping that took part, and lots of land were moved, and there are lots of these areas that were important that we put out very much land and ponds around the river. Next, please. This is a theoretical model, which actually shows that the ideas of the farmers are quite the same as you can see high from the European Union. The idea of biodiversity is important. We have to keep up and have a long-term view and sustainable view from the farmers. And this has to be communicated because in between there are some parliamentarians, there are some other lawmakers that slightly get the message lost. So somewhat the good ideas both from bottom up and top down get lost in translation, especially when we didn't have a real legal network for this. So what is important here is a target-oriented approach. It's a dialogue. You have to speak with the lawmakers and take it from up and listen and have a target-oriented control. So the target-oriented approach is extremely important in this case. Thank you. So what are it's very important when you put up some clear objectives. And as you see here, we have the mitigation of nutrients, we have the erosions, we have the biodiversity, which has increased enormously, both inside the water and besides the water, with the bird species has increased fantastically 3 or 4 times around this. The local social engagement is very important because you have a good dialogue with the community and also the authorities, and not least you get a good ecological status. This is what we are achieving. This is according to the Water Directive. That is very important. And at last, measuring is important. You have to show that you get some good results here. And that's the proof of the pudding. Thank you. The next one. So what are the results? Yes, we have gone through this quite recently. It is the environmental, economical, and social result that are, I think, is very important in this, because this is a multi-tardical project, and I think that the social aspect is extremely important, and you have to have a project leader that keeps things together. Next, please. So what could I recommend? This is, I think you have to show what you can do. You have to have it has to be science-based, and we have to put up some good targets, and it is in line with long-term European lawmaking, but it is important to have to communicate the plans to the other landowners, to the authorities, and also with the local community, and the long-term perspectives. That's the important thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Otto. It was very interesting and with very good recommendations. I would like to remember you that you can type questions for any speaker in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them in about 10 minutes. For the next speaker, we will take you to Belgium, because we have Christophe Lenaerts with us, and he's engaged in the case of the Nato Airfield. Christophe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie, and thank you for ELO for organizing this webinar and the great project around Land is Forever and giving us the floor. I hope this will also lead to a better understanding of opportunities that we have to work with private landowners all through Europe in the future. The history of the airfield is very important in the story. Muller Airport or Zuursel Airport, whatever, for people flying, it's EBZR, is located in the Belgian province of Antwerp. It's entirely in the municipality of Muller, and it was built in 1952 as a NATO reserve airfield. The airfield was one of the 6 reserve airfields built at the request of NATO in Belgium from 52 onwards, with SHAPE, the supreme headquarters of Allied Powers Europe, its NATO Central Command Center, defining the criteria for these installations. The other alternative airports were Bertry in Ursel, Saint-Hubert, Weelde, and Zuttendal. The airfield, as you can see on the picture, is quite big. It was built on old land dunes and heatherlands. Around the airfield, you can still see part of those land dunes. But most of them have been planted with pine trees for use in the coal mines in Limburg. The expropriations of the airfield took place after the building was complete. An old Belgian law under Napoleon influence dating in 1834 gives the right to the expropriated to claim back their lands for if public use of the expropriation has not or is not being used anymore. Yes, there we go. The infrastructure today, it's covering 200 hectares. The airfield has one runway consisting of concrete slabs, which was constructed in the 0523 direction. And the runway is 3,000 meters long and 45 meters wide, and it can hold big bombers. The parallel taxiway, also made of concrete slabs, is 2,500 meters long and 22 meters wide. The road could also be used as a spare runway in case of an emergency. There should also be aircraft sheds, shelters, fuel depots, ammunition depots on the terrain with a vast road network around. A partially public road network and partially private. The private roads hold also a defense easement for their usage. Yes, thank you. For the use, during the weekdays, the base is in use by the Ministry of Defense. The terrain was and still used, but it was occasionally used for the logistics base for the operation Reforger. It's a return of the forces to Germany, an exercise conducted by the United States in the context of NATO during the Cold War. This exercise tested how quickly army units in Germany could be deployed in the event of a conflict with the Warsaw Pact. This all was dissolved in 1991, and the last event was in 1990. Between 61 and 2007, the base was used by the Belgian Air Cadets as part of their glider pilot training. My mother was even the first pilot there flying. Now the airport is being used by private civilian flying clubs. There are three different clubs. And furthermore, the taxiway is occasionally made available for test drives with vehicles from police and private companies. I think we can see that on the next pictures. There you go. The natural sandy soil on the northeast side of the airport is also used every year for the International Closing Cyclocross Award, which takes place in February. And we also have different scouts camps and other events using the location. The guy on the picture is Wout van Aert, who had second place yesterday at the World Cycling. Every year we also have a fly-in organized during the summer vacations, and during this activity we have about 20 to 30,000 people visiting the airfield. There is no stunt flying, but the arriving planes are parked on the taxiway so that visitors can watch them. We also have a local water company, Pitpa, that is using the water for extraction for water usage. And then we also have a lot of photo and film shoots happening on the airfield and around in the adjacent private estates. The Camel, for instance, was there this summer for a photo shoot. Also NGOs use it for a walk. The airport is managed today by the military command of the province of Antwerp because there is no unit stationed there. But the natural richness of the domain was maintained by the DANA project, which is a live project started in 2003, a partnership between the Ministry of Defense and the Agency for Nature and Forests. The aim of this collaboration was to promote the restoration of the nature on military domains. The project ended in 2010, but the Agency for Nature and Forest continues to manage the area. The question that arises, of course, is how it is possible that so much money for the public has been spent for a nature restoration program and now is not used anymore in the same way. What concerns nature, the whole surface, as Jürgen mentioned, is Nature 2000. The natural environment of the airport consists mainly of forest and heathland. The Agency for Nature and Forest considers the area to be very important for breeding and migratory birds. 157 species of birds were observed, including wheatear, tree-lark, and curlew. The insect population is also considered very valuable. Many red species are present there. So from 2003 to 2010, we had the LIFE project. And now what about the future? The airfield is for sale. And so the 4 private landowners owning the estate around the Nato airfield, together with Natuurpunt, it's Flanders' largest nature NGO, have signed a gentleman agreement with the Flemish authorities to acquire, manage, and develop the airfield. In the agreement, we state that the primary use is the high nature values who need to be kept and developed where needed. On top of that, the current usage by recreational and professional users is guaranteed for the future. The social impact of that recreational usage is very high in the neighboring villages and towns. We have over 50,000 visitors and users, and so it's very important to keep that social aspect. As the current users don't pay much of the new financials, it will have an impact on the users. You must know that somebody using the airfield today pays 150 euros to the defense agency or ministry. Slide, please. As you can see on the slide, we have different uses that are prepared on and around the airfield with walking ways, pedestrian, bicycling, etc. So the idea is that with the usage and the visitor fees in the future, in any form, there should be enough income to have the new airfield structure self-sustaining. For Landelijk Vlaanderen, this project is also of capital importance to show that private landowners care about nature. They care about nature preservation also and can contribute heavily to the goals set up by Europe and Belgium. Aside from that partnership of this size between private landowners and nature NGO, Natuurpunt is unseen. If it works out, and I believe it will, It will create a precedent for other private landowners and Natuurpunt to work together. The structure is a private NGO with 4 landowners and Natuurpunt. A stakeholder group will also involve the users the stakeholders of the airfield. We will make a type 4 nature preservation plan, and Natuurpunt will do the active management on the terrain. Currently, we are in the final phase of to sell, but we do have some opposition of defense. Although they had the European funds for the Life Plus project, today the future of nature doesn't seem to be the priority with the sell, but only the highest bidder has their interest. I guess it has something to do also with our current government negotiations where political and national politics are playing. So we do hope it finally all comes together and that we can buy back our land and make this project an example for Belgium and Europe.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Very interesting and also a very nice example of diversification of services that you were offering at the airfield area. We have heard all our speakers now. You can still send us your questions in the Q&A box. But before answering these questions, I would like to give the floor back to Jürgen to give us a small wrap-up of our 50-minute session. Jürgen.
Yes, Anne-Sophie, thank you very much. I have to say I'm very pleased because we have heard some very interesting testimonies of private landowners, how they tackle private land conservation, but also where their problems are. What I have learned up to now is that on one side, we have we have 7 case studies. We have heard a better explanation of 2 of them. But what we see is that, well, we have many different types of landowners. And those many different types of landowners are clearly using very different instruments. And not only very different instruments, but they are also organized in very different ways. And that is for me a very intriguing issue, because it's not like a major NGO who is having a clear strategy, and where as a government it's clear how to react to the demands of such an NGO. Here we see that we have many different participants with many different views and many different beliefs on how private nature conservation can be developed. And that makes that automatically you need a broad set of instruments. I would call it a menu. It's like going into a restaurant and you have a choice of food. Well, those private landowners clearly enjoy having a menu of different instruments. And that makes it possible for them, depending on the situation they have, depending on the engagement they want to take, they can make a choice out of the different instruments which are offered to them. And that is exactly what we have seen in the different case studies, and what we see to the 2 case studies which were presented today, is that, let's say, they are organized in very different ways. And yes, they are making use of very different instruments. And so it's important to offer. On the other side, as a government, and if we want to give advice to EU member states on one side, to the European Commission on other sides, we are looking exactly for what are the best instruments on the market to engage private landowners further on in private land conservation. That's something we did not discuss today. That's something we will discuss during the webinar next Wednesday. So I think I will wrap up over here with what I have seen and heard today.
Thank you, Jürgen. Very clear. All right, then we have a little bit of time left for the questions that you have sent us. Thank you for sending us these. And we will start with a very quite general question for our 2 landowners that we received. And the question is, why did you engage in this project? What was your personal motivation as a landowner to step in this project? Otto, if you want to take the floor.
Thank you so much. I think it is very important to show that there is that's the sustainability in the farming is very important, and you have to look at all the three dimensions of that, both the economical side, which has so far been very much the driving force, but the ecological side is as important. And not to mention the social side, because many farmers are lonely today, and to work together is an important part. The ecological side is also, I would stress very much, because we have losses of land and healthy soils. We have losses of biodiversity, etc. This has to really come into the new model in the EU, and we see what's happening. And what the Commission has come up with, both the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, and Farm to Fork. I think those are very very clever and in the right time to put these on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Christophe, do you want to add to this?
Well, yes. Personally, why I got involved, of course, it's land that was from my family. So that was the first step, of course, try to get it back and develop it. And then why try to create a project with my neighbors and with the Nature NGO? Well, we were blocked. Nature NGO Natuurpunt wanted to buy the airport. Some other people, maybe also industrials, etc. Imagine that this size airport, you can buy it and develop it as a industrial airport. It could be catastrophic for the Nature 2000 preservation there. So with the 4 landowners around here, the airport, we were all on this in unison to try to make it as best as possible. And the only way to go forward was to join forces with Natuurpunt and the Nature NGO, and that's what we want to create. Also, is create one of the largest acquisitions in Belgium. 225 hectares is not that small, so at least not for Belgium. So that's why we want to do this.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a question for Jürgen. So you have explained us, presented us 7 inspiring cases, but what do you see now as the next steps? For example, how can we upscale them to other regions in Europe? What is important for this?
What is extremely important is that we have seen that some of the instruments which were used by the private landowners within the case studies, but also out of information we got from the questionnaires we have sent around, is that we see that some of the instruments are much more successful than others. Some of the structures also seems to be much more successful than others. And then of course, if you can combine the ideal instrument with the ideal structure, then you come to a very strong basis to set up a nature management plan. And that is exactly, I think, what we want to do. We want to scale up and we want to attract other private landowners now, making use of those successful instruments, of those successful structures to set up new nature management plans so that the total amount of private land under nature conservation can grow in Europe, because we absolutely need that private land to make sure that we are capable of halting the loss of biodiversity in Europe and beyond.
Okay, that's clear, thank you. Next question is a question for, again, both of our landowners. So both of you are actively involved in private nature conservation, and often this is difficult to engage private landowners. So a question for you, what do you think is the most important reason not to participate, or to participate? Which tool do you think for you would be very interesting to use? For example, taxation change, subsidies, recognition for what you are doing. So which one of these is the most important one for you? Christophe?
Okay, sure. Well, I think there are a couple of things there. First of all, in most cases, and I think it's proven all through Europe, private nature conservation and private land ownership is way cheaper than giving it in the hands of the government or an administration or a nature NGO, because the private landowner in most of cases will put his private money in the development and the maintaining of that land, whereas a nature NGO is mostly funded by public funds. So that's one thing. Doesn't mean that nature NGOs can't do a job or shouldn't do a job. In some cases, they're very useful. But we also see, at least in Belgium and in Flanders, that sometimes they buy to harass a private landowner instead of helping nature, and so there the use is not there. So I think that's a very important point for us. There are many, of course, why private land ownership is important, but it's also a family tradition in most cases. You know, people have land for generations, and they want to transmit that to the next generations. Whereas other people see an investment not in money but in nature and in future. So that also should be pushed forward.
Okay, thank you. Otto, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think the long-term perspective of handling and managing land, and land is not only for, of course, it is important to have a production from land. That's good to have, but you have to see that this all fits together. When you have a long-term perspective, then you're also careful about the environment and why you should take care of the land, because if you distort it, you distort your own economy. That's one reason. I think also that the private landowners has this long-term perspective, as was said, and they are looking for it in many generations. And you can see, if you plant a tree, it's not for the sake of your own, it's maybe for your great-grandchildren, etc., depending on what tree you're planting. But this is important, and also to see that the management of the land has somehow been very one-dimensionally looked upon, and now we have to see it in a more comprehensive view in the way. And also, I think it is a responsibility. If you're a good landowner, then you have to take responsibility of the land that you own, and you don't just not use in short time. Look at in the long term. And this also means that you have, it's not only the land, etc. It's also the water and of course how the pollution into the air. But this has to be looked upon in a comprehensive view. Way.
Okay, thank you, Otto. And I see we have 1 minute left. We received one feedback from a participant, from Carmen Perona, from the Vivencia de Hesa project. And she's saying that our biggest problem is due to obstacles imposed by the government to manage our land. Maybe to end the session, Jürgen, can you give your advice to this feedback?
I first of all can say that she's certainly not the only one who is making this comment. We have seen throughout the lifespan of the project, with many of the landowners we have spoken to, that indeed they see quite a number of obstacles imposed by governments. Now, quite often those what we see as obstacles were put in place by governments with a certain reason, but quite often we see that even the idea of the government was quite good at the beginning, that a lot of private landowners are struggling with many of those what she's calling obstacles. I think that also the participants of today can have shown that kind of problems. Now, of course, those obstacles are not disappearing, so we have to make sure that we find either a way around them or we are learning to work with them. And what we have seen is that if we put people together around some of those obstacles, and let's say that with a little bit of innovative thinking, that quite often we find solutions. What of course is also a need is that we make it clear to governments, to policymakers, where those problems exactly are and why they are a problem for private landowners, because quite often they do not understand why this is a problem for a private landowner. And that's something we have to explain. And let's say within the Land is Forever project, we have identified a number of instruments to get around those problems, to get around those restrictions. And well, that are the instruments we will propose next Wednesday. So I hope she's going to look to the next webinar, and I hope we can assist her with a number of instruments that could be useful in her case.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. That was a perfect advice to end this session. So I would like to thank Christophe, Otto, and Jürgen for your excellent presentation and a lot of good information to take into account for hopefully many upcoming conservation initiatives. Also, warm thank you to you, to our audience, to join us today. And as we already said, we're looking forward to welcome you again on Wednesday, same time, where we will have our final session, our 4th webinar of this series on the future of private land conservation in Europe. Also remember that you can rewatch this webinar on our website, and I hope to see you all on Wednesday. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye.